Our Father in heaven, we want to thank you for the privilege of being here tonight. Thank you for your safe travels that you've granted to us. And as we take time now to consider your word, the 11th chapter of Daniel, the first part, we ask for your Holy Spirit to attend our time, to grant us wisdom and understanding, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so we're not going to read the whole chapter. That's 45 verses. So tonight, we're going to take the first kind of bite out of it, and that's the first 13 verses. And as we read through the first 13 verses, I think you may see why we're not going to go too much further than that in our first study. So, let's go ahead and have three readers. Who would be willing to read verses 1 and 2? So we're in Daniel 11, verses 1 and 2. Okay, Doug's going to read 1 and 2. Then verses 3 and 4. Okay, 3 and 4, Judy. And then the long section, that's, we're going to take a fairly big bite there, verses 5 through 13. Who would like 5 through 13? Okay, Jeff, you want to take that? All right. So we're in Daniel chapter 11, starting with verse number 1. Let's all follow along together.
Is that me? Also, I, in the first year of Darius the Mede, even I stood to confirm and to strengthen him. And now will I show thee the truth. Behold, there shall stand up yet 3 kings in Persia, and the fourth shall be far richer than they all. And by his strength, through his riches, he shall stir up all against the realm of Grecia.
And a mighty king shall stand up, that shall rule with great dominion, and do according to his will. And when he shall stand up, his kingdom shall be broken, and shall be divided toward the 4 winds of heaven, and not to his posterity, nor according to his dominion which he ruled. For his kingdom shall be plucked up, even for others beside those.
Through 11, Pastor, through 11.
Through verse 13.
13, sorry, okay. Also the king of the south shall become strong, as well as one of his princes, and he shall gain power over him and have dominion. His dominion shall be a great dominion. And at the end of some years they shall join forces. For the daughter of the king of the south shall go to the king of the north to make an agreement. But she shall not retain the power of her authority, and neither he nor his authority shall stand, but she shall be given up with those who brought her, and with him who begot her, and with him who strengthened her in those times. But from a branch of her roots one shall arise in his place, who shall come with an army, enter the fortress of the king of the north, and deal with them and prevail. And he shall also carry their gods captive to Egypt, with their princes and their precious articles of silver and gold, and he shall continue more years than the king of the north. Also the king of the north shall come to the kingdom of the king of the south, but shall return to his own land. However, his sons shall stir up strife, and assemble a multitude of great forces. And one shall certainly come and overwhelm and pass through, then he shall return to his fortress and stir up strife. And the king of the south shall be moved with rage, and go out and fight with him, with the king of the north, who shall muster a great multitude. But the multitude shall be given into the hand of his enemy. When he has taken away the multitude, his heart will be lifted up, and he will cast down tens of thousands, but he will not prevail. For the king of the north will return and muster a multitude greater than the former, and shall certainly come at the end of some years with a great army and much equipment.
All right. So that is the beginnings of the movements between the king of the north and the king of the south. And by the way, for 45 verses, you see this discussion pretty much all the way through. These movements back and forth. King of the north, king of the south. King of the north, king of the south. King of the north, king of the south. And tonight we'll put together a couple of main keys that I believe will help us to understand how to follow these movements. And I think we mentioned last night at our study, those of you who were able to be last night as we went through Daniel chapter 10, if we don't get the beginnings right on this, we're going to be off in all kinds of directions. But if we start in the right place, then we're able to follow along. So let's see how we can start here. So let's go to our outline. We want to begin our discussion of the main issues. And each night, of course, we talk about the structure. What did we read? In verses 1 and 2, Gabriel, we believe it's the angel Gabriel, although his name is not mentioned in chapter 10. We believe that it's Gabriel because he's continuing information from the previous vision, which was chapters 8 and 9, where in both those chapters it's the angel Gabriel. So in verses 1 and 2, we believe that it's Gabriel. Gabriel shares truth of further unfolding of Persian history. What kind of history? Persian history. And that helps us to start in the right place. Verses 3 and 4, we see a mighty king in Greece, and Greece being broken toward what?
The four winds.
Yeah, the four winds of heaven. And then in verses 5 through 13, we see the four kingdoms of Greece over time merging into two. And the two, of course, are the king of the north and the king of the south. Point 2, Daniel 11 repeats and enlarges the previous prophecies of Daniel, particularly the vision from chapter 8. It begins with a discussion of events in what ruling empire? Persia. And moves on through history from there. And again, that's important for us to see. I've read material where they start the movements of the king in the north. They put this all still in the future. And, they start in places where it's like you scratch your head and wonder, why do they start there? There's some people who believe that this is a discussion of the United States and Russia. And it's like, how do you get that from the text? So it's best just to start in the place where Gabriel said that it starts.
What a concept.
What's that?
What a concept.
Yeah, exactly. What a concept. Point 3, the language of Daniel is not the easiest to follow. Even in the Hebrew language, I've talked to some Hebrew scholars about Daniel chapter 11, and I've asked them, is Daniel 11, is it smoother in the Hebrew language as it discusses the movements between the king of the north and the king of the south? Is it smoother in the Hebrew language than what it is as we translate it into the English language? And I've talked to 4 or 5 Hebrew scholars, and all of them have said, no, it's not easier. And so, the language of Daniel 11 is not easy to follow, but we will do our best to let the prophecy unveil itself historically. I believe that's the best way to take it. Because all the other prophecies are unfolded how? Historically. Daniel 2, Daniel 7, Daniel 8. It makes sense that the last vision is a repeat and enlargement of the previous ones. Therefore, they unfold historically. It is better to, this is not so much a thought that I've gotten from commentaries or other speakers on this issue, but it's my opinion. It's better to admit that you are not sure. As we go through the discussions and movements of the King of the North and King of the South, it's better to admit you're not sure than to force an interpretation upon the text that does not fit the setting or the picture.
I didn't get the answer for the first part of that because I wasn't paying attention.
Yeah, the language of Daniel is not easy to follow, but we will do our best to let the prophecy unveil itself historically.
Okay.
Yeah. And it is better to admit that you're not sure than to force an interpretation upon the text that does not fit the picture or the setting, or you can even say the context. That's the idea there. Now, the information that we'll be studying tonight and the next couple of nights, maybe 3 nights, and then we'll have one night for just Daniel chapter 12. We can cover Daniel 12 in one night. Is from the historicist position, and most of what we're going to be covering is from books that I've read from the early movement of this particular church, the Seventh-day Adventist Church, what we call the early Advent movement. There were historical scholars and Bible scholars, I believe, a gentleman by the name of Uriah Smith, a gentleman by the name of Stephen Haskell, and I'm also going off of the work of some individuals now who I'm friends with that have spent, one guy spent about 20 years, the past 20 years, just studying Daniel chapter 11, the last 5 verses, verses 40 to 45, and watching the movements of what's taking place in the Middle East. And he's got, his take on it. I don't particularly agree with his take, but I'm just letting you know that there are, if you take it historically, which we're going to do, there are some people that even do take it historically that don't agree on everything. So I'm presenting you what makes sense to me, and hopefully that will make somewhat sense to you. If it doesn't make sense, then study it. And you might be able to give me some ideas of how I can do a better job. So let's go to point number 4. The key to following the movements between the king of the north and king of the south. Would you like to know what the key is? And this is not a difficult thing. All right? The key to following the movements between the king of the north and king of the south is this. Whoever controls the territory is the king.
Oh, the king. The king, period?
Yeah, is the king of the north or the king of the south. Whoever controls the territory is the king.
Okay.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
I think you mentioned to me before we were talking about this, that it doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be geographically there, physically there, located there, right? They just have to be in control of the territory.
They have to be in control of the territory. Yeah. So at this point, let me look at things here. I'm going to draw a map of the Mediterranean world on a whiteboard. And you'll notice that my wonderful art skills won't be quite to scale. But I think you'll get the idea. But let's go to point number 5 before we go to the board. So after Cyrus, so let's remind ourselves a little bit of the context of Daniel chapter 10, what we studied last night. Daniel chapter 10 takes place in the 3rd year of Cyrus, as Daniel is writing it. In the book of Ezra, it's the 1st year, but that's because Cyrus ruled for 3 years. 2 of those 3 years was under his uncle, who led the Medo-Persian Empire. Cyrus takes over. In the 3rd year of Cyrus, we see this discussion where Daniel is in prayer, Christ shows up, the angel Gabriel shows up, and the angel Gabriel gives him some information. So this discussion of chapter 10, 11, and 12, all this discussion is given to Daniel when he's on the river Hiddekel. This is the 3rd year of Cyrus. God's people are about to be set free to leave captivity and go back to their homeland in Jerusalem. And so that's the setting. Cyrus is the king in Persia. So you notice that in verse 2 it says, "And now I will show thee the truth. Behold, there shall stand up yet" what? 3 kings, 3 more kings in Persia, and then the 4th shall be what?
Or Richard.
Far richer than they all. By his strength and through his riches he shall stir up all against the realm of Grecia. So that's not going to be too difficult to figure out, because all we have to do is say, okay, there was Darius the Mede, then the second ruler of Persia, Cyrus, and then after him there's 3 more, and then there's a 4th guy. And then what does the 4th guy do? Stirs up Greece, which, by the way, is not a smart move. At least history tells us it was not a smart move. So who are the 3 after Cyrus? The next one after Cyrus, I given ourselves a little bit of room there to make some notes there. The next guy after Cyrus was a guy named Cambyses. Cambyses, Cambyses. And he ruled for 8 years.
How do we spell it?
Cambyses, Cambyses. The next guy who rules is what history calls most likely a false ruler, because he was the youngest son of Cambyses. The guy's name was Bardia. He's also called False Smerdis amongst the Greeks.
Guamata or something like that. I read that somewhere.
What did you say, Rose?
I got Guamata, Gaumata. But he only ruled 1 year, so there must have been. That's not. It's in the book I read.
I've seen that name, and I don't remember. I don't remember the discussion on that name. I have seen that name.
So who'd you say then this time?
Yeah, you can put False Smerdis. Smerdis is Smerdis. That's what he's commonly known by.
Why do they call him false then?
We'll talk about that here in a second.
Well,
Another name for him is this Bardia. Bardiya.
Can you do that again?
Bardiya. Bardia. Historians call this Bardia guy False Smerdis. And the reason why is because he was not in line to be the next king, because he was the youngest. But there were people in the kingdom that wanted him to be king, so they just kind of voted him in. But he ruled less than a year. I'm thinking that there might be another name for this guy, because he had a couple of different names.
Because this guy only ruled a year.
Only ruled a year,
Yeah.
and then he was ousted because they did a little research and found out, you know what, you really aren't supposed to be here. So they ousted him from the palace. So then the next guy was the rightful one, and that was Darius. That is Darius number 1. Darius 1.
So is this the Darius in verse 1 then?
No.
This is a different
Yeah.
Darius.
Darius in verse 1 is just simply Darius.
I noticed when I was reading in the Smith book lots of people have the same names all the way down
Yeah.
through.
Yeah,
It's so confusing.
Yeah, so, and we're gonna notice that in our discussion over the next few nights, when we discuss the Seleucid dynasty and the Ptolemaic dynasty. Most of the names in the Seleucid dynasty are Seleucid, then Seleucus I, Seleucus II, Seleucus III. Now they had other names to go with that, but history just puts numbers on them to keep it easier to understand. And that's what we'll do here as well. So the names in the Seleucid dynasty are either Seleucid or Antiochus. Those are the two names mostly that go back and forth. Down south in Egypt, the Egyptian Empire, is pretty much all the Ptolemaic names. Ptolemaic I, Ptolemaic II, Ptolemaic III. And then you have other names next to Ptolemaic, like Ptolemaic Philopator. We're going to get confused if we do it that way. So we just do Ptolemaic I, Ptolemaic II, Ptolemaic III. It'll be easier for us to follow. Yeah.
All right, so if we start with Darius and then Cyrus, then Cambius comes next.
Well, we
I'm
don't-
trying to start
Here
above
in
what we
the
know.
discussion, when Daniel has the vision, we're not actually starting with Darius, we're starting with Cyrus.
Okay.
Darius is mentioned in verse 1, but only because, you remember, the angel Gabriel is telling Daniel, Daniel, we've been working behind the scenes with the Prince of Persia. And then as you make the transition to chapter 11, Gabriel's saying, and by the way, we're also working with Darius the Mede. So verse 1 is just kind of an affirmation to Daniel. We've been working behind the scenes, and by the way, we haven't only been working behind the scenes with Cyrus, we did it with Darius as well. But then as you continue on the information after that, it is not while Darius is ruling, it's while Cyrus is ruling. And so these kings are after Cyrus. Of course, they're after Darius too, but we're going to mess up on the count if we start with Darius. Does that make sense?
How do you know that it's, which king it is that's being talked about in the rest of the book?
Well, that's where we have to follow it carefully. All right?
So in the text itself, or just by putting things?
Well, in the text itself, and then just looking at history and saying, for example, we know that Gabriel is telling Daniel there are 3 kings and then a 4th king after Cyrus. All right?
Is that in chapter 10?
Well, that's the list.
Well, we just read it. That's in verse 2 of chapter 11.
Verse 2.
Verse 2, and now I will show you the truth. Behold, there shall stand up yet 3 kings in Persia, and the 4th shall be far richer than they all, and by his strength, through his riches, he shall stir up all against the realm of Grecia.
So how do you know that's Cyrus?
Because Cyrus is the king of Persia at the time of this vision.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because Darius was the king of the Medes. Okay, got it.
Well, yeah, it began with the combined powers of the Medes and the Persian. Darius was the first king. But then Persia became, remember in the vision, both Daniel 7 and Daniel 8, when you had the picture of the Medes and the Persians, one ended up being higher and stronger than the rest. Well, which one was that?
Cyrus.
Yeah, that was Persia, or the first king of Persia, Cyrus. Darius, his uncle, was the first king of the combined kingdoms. Media kind of fades from the scene. Persia rules the world for over 150 years. Okay, so we have Cambyses, we have the false Smyrtus, we have Darius I. Those are the 3. Anybody know who the 4th one is? That ends up being stronger and far richer.
Xerxes.
That's Xerxes.
He's got to be in there somewhere.
Yeah. So the fourth one was Xerxes. Xerxes followed Darius I. So that's Xerxes. Xerxes. He's also known as Ahasuerus from the book of Esther. Yeah. That would be Esther's husband.
Yeah, I wish I knew how to spell that.
The spelling on Ahasuerus, Ahasueras. Yeah, I don't know why these guys had to have names like this. Well, I guess we can be thankful that we don't have names like Maher-shalal-Hash-Baz. You know, one of the longest names in the Bible. Maher-shalal-Hash-Baz. That's kind of a mean-sounding name, isn't it? Okay, and Xerxes. He ended up being far richer than, you know, the other guys. The other guys had their rule. By the way, I think I mentioned that Cambyses ruled 8 years, while Smyrnus less than a year. Darius I ruled 36 years. And then began the rule of the Xerxes. The first one is the one in Queen Esther's days. And history tells us about this Xerxes and all the Xerxes. They were very wealthy. And through their wealth, that's how they pretty much ruled the world, was through their wealth. And also, the first Xerxes, he began to put together troops because he was noticing there was another country that was fairly strong. It wasn't ruling the world at that time, but it had a lot of strength. And Xerxes, you know, the other kings before him, wasn't concerned that much about Greece, but Xerxes was. So he started building arms and started doing what we might call terrorist activity against the country of Greece. And the Xerxes after him continued that actually for over 100 years, like around 140 years. And Greece finally decided, you know what? We've had enough of this. And the text here says that this fourth king would stir up all against the realm of Grecia. And history tells us that's exactly what the Xerxes did. Was they tried to keep Grecia in check. And so they had these little battles here and there for quite some time. And Greece finally, from the west, put its foot down and ended up conquering Persia. Yeah,
Both of those powers created or enhanced their naval capacities as well.
yes.
And Persia tried to do a bridge across to attack Greece.
Yeah.
And there's some that was a
And the time of Persia, the time when the Greeks ruled, and then of course when the Romans came on, they used the Mediterranean Sea, and their navies on the Mediterranean to control that part of the world. Yeah, so they used, and if they had aircraft at that time, they would have used aircraft. They didn't have aircraft at that time. Any question on point 5? There are the 3 kings and then the 4th king. So far, do we see the historical flow? It's easy to follow the historical flow at this point. And if we get confused on the historical flow right here, we're going to be lost as we get into the movements of the king of the north and the king of the south. So let's continue the historical flow. Point 6, what does the 4th king do? What's the answer? He stirs up all against the realm of who? Grecia. And history tells us how that turned out. Who ended up winning the battle between Persia and Greece? Greece did. And Greece, what was that? Yes, Alexander the Great came on. We've talked about him as we studied Daniel 7 and Daniel 8. Here in Daniel 11, it's just a little bit more detail of that history. That's why we say that these prophecies are, as you move through the book of Daniel, they're repeat and enlarge. And the enlarged part is just giving a little more detail. So he stirs up Grecia. Grecia ends up winning. So then verse 3 says, after he stirs up Grecia, then a mighty king shall stand up that shall rule with what kind of dominion? Great dominion, do according to his will. And when he shall stand up, his kingdom shall be broken. Have we read that before?
Yeah.
Yes.
Alexander the Great.
And shall be divided toward what? Four winds of heaven. Have we read that before?
Yeah.
So it's easy to place the flow of history here, isn't it? And not to his posterity. This is the added information, by the way. His kingdom is broken, divided into four winds of heaven. And not to his posterity, nor according to his dominion which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be plucked up, even for others beside those. And so, who is the next great king after the reign of Cyrus and Cambyses, the false guy, Darius I, and then you have a whole line of Xerxes that rule for around 140 years. After that, Greece is stirred up. So who's the great one of Greece that ends up coming in?
Alexander the Great.
Yeah, Alexander the Great. No one compares to him. So point 7, verse 3, who is the mighty king that rules with great dominion? Alexander the Great. And then his kingdom is divided into four. We've studied that before. Point 8, this kingdom is broken and divided into the four winds of heaven. What is this?
His generals.
Yeah, his four generals. There were actually more than four generals. There were about a dozen of them. But it took, after about 22 years after Alexander passed away, that kingdom was honed down. All the generals were trying to take this part and that part and that part and that part. And it took a little over 20 years to get that hammered down to four, just as God's word said it would. And it went not to the four horns of like Daniel chapter 7, but it's to, or Daniel 8, but it's to the four winds of heaven. That is the different directions of the compass. And so you had one general ended up taking the northern territory. That was Seleucus. He becomes the king of the north. You have one general. History tells us that one of the best generals of Alexander actually was this Ptolemy guy. And he ended up ruling the southern part of the then known world. You know, what we call Egypt and northern Africa. And for a while, even the land of Palestine a little bit. So he became the king of the south. And then you had a guy named Cassander. And he took the west, you know, covered Italy and west. That would be like Western Europe. And then there was Lysimachus, and he covered Syria and towards Babylon and towards Asia. He became the leader of the East.
Can you spell Cassander and Lysimachus?
Cassander is spelled C-A-S-S-A-N-D-E-R. Cassander. And C-A-S-S-A-N-D-E-R. Yeah, some people could say Cassander. I say Cassander. However it's pronounced. And Lysimachus, L-Y-S-I-M-A-C-H-U-S. Macchus. Lysimachus.
And once again, what countries did he rule?
Yeah, Seleucus ruled the north. Ptolemy, that's spelled Ptolemy, Ptolemy. The P is silent. Ruled the south. Cassander ruled the west. And Lysimachus ruled the east.
What countries in the east?
At that, well, we would call that, like today, we would call that, the area of Iraq and east to Asia and China. To the west, that would be Italy and the Western European nations.
Would that include Britain?
Yeah, it went as far west as to the Atlantic Ocean. And then when Rome would come on the scene, Rome ruled the entire Mediterranean world. From Western Europe, from the Atlantic, clear east to Asia. Rome ruled the whole thing. Okay, I think now we're going to, let's go to the board. Are you ready for this? So, I'm going to draw the Mediterranean Sea. So let's go like this. And like this. Let's make this. There's a little boot that comes down through here. Ah, see, that's not bad. What do you think?
Good, that's cool.
Yeah. That's not cool. So, guess what this right here is, by the way?
Italy.
That'd be Italy, so at least you got that part. And so, right here, it's going to be Rome. Right? And, let's put a line kind of like this. So this is going to be the Atlantic Sea. That's not bad, huh? Anybody gonna guess what this would be? That would be what?
Nile River.
Yeah, the Euphrates, not Euphrates, but the Nile River Delta, Nile River. So this would be northern Africa. This would be Egypt. Okay. What would this be about right here?
Jerusalem.
That'd be Jerusalem. So let's put Jerusalem here. Right about probably in here is going to be Babylon. And the Euphrates River Valley, there's the Tigris there and the Hiddekel. This is going to be what back then what was called Asia Minor. And this is going to be Asia and what we might call the Far East. There you go. So that's a basic outline map of the then known world. And so Greece ruled all that. Alexander died, and then about 22 years later, his kingdom is divided into four. So you have Ptolemy down here, you have Seleucus up in this area, Cassander, and the other guy. Yeah, Lysimachus.
Sorry, I couldn't quite hear you.
Oh, your new phone was working.
working well.
My sincere apology. This is not the new phone. This is the old one. It's doing things like.
I'm not sure I'm hearing you correctly.
Yeah, my apologies to Siri. I didn't touch that thing. Did you notice that? You know, it's just sitting there. It's supposed to. It's on, you know, some kind of mode there that's quiet.
He's listening in.
It's listening in to the message. That's good.
Yeah, Pastor Mike, so at that time, it took 20 years for the generals to get their area, so, but Greece was still ruling that, at that point. So were they bickering back and forth? Was there war between?
Yeah,
trying to
history
decide?
tells us that all these generals, I mean, he had a lot of generals. He had like 12, 14, 15 generals. And they all wanted a piece of the pie, so to speak. And so they fought for their territories. And they kind of buddied up a little bit, you know. And, you know, so when they buddied up a little bit, it's these two guys against this guy here. That guy there's not going to stand a chance, so then these two guys get a bigger piece of the pie. And then once that happens, guess what they do?
Fight each other.
Kind of fight each other, you know, and try to, and it ended up being divided into the four winds of heaven.
And that took 20 years to do that.
And, yeah, about 22 years. At least from what I've read in the history books that I have. Yeah. So then, as we move further in, so we're at basically verse 4, but then verse 5 says, and the king of the south shall be strong, and one of his princes, he shall be strong above him and have dominion. His dominion shall be a great dominion. And then begins this discussion of not the four winds of heaven, but what?
The two.
The two.
South and north.
So the four, as it goes through time, end up merging into two. And this is what I'm going to put on the board that at least in my mind, it makes sense because it follows the flow of what we're doing so far, just what's in the text. So what ends up happening is you have the northern territory here, that's like this right here. And then you have the southern territory, that's like this right here. That's their main territories that it comes down to now. And so, if you were to ask the question, well, who's the king of the north? This is the king of the north. And who's the king of the south? Whoever controls those pieces of geography in the discussion of Daniel 11 as it flows through history. Whoever controls this is the king of the north. Whoever controls this is what? The king of the south.
Whether they were kings or not to begin with, right?
Yeah. And
So we don't even worry about the east and west.
not so much because the guy up here, Seleucus, he takes over the territory of Cassander and Lysimachus. His main headquarters, though, is this area right here. Well, by the way, what we would today call Syria and Turkey. Right? Which today is controlled by, at least in the spiritual sense, the Muslim religion. And so one more thing I want to point out, at least from a geographic standpoint, and that is in between the movements of the king of the north and the king of the south, who's in between?
Yeah, yeah. God's people, right there.
Hmm?
Yeah.
Jerusalem is in between. God's people.
It reminds me of when I was a kid, my dad had in the backseat, my big brother got one window, then what, the other brother got this window, I was in the middle.
Yeah, that's what happens. And so as we see the movements of the king of the north and the king of the south, as we follow it through, God's people are in between, pretty much the whole way. And the last 5 verses of Daniel chapter 11, I believe that most of those verses are still future. And I believe that this area right here is still in between. And there's going to be, I believe this is going to play a part in Bible, in prophetic history that is still yet future. That has to be future. That's the glorious land. Yeah.
So that means one of them guys is trying to get that in-between one, right? Are they trying to get control of it?
Yeah, as these two are going back and forth, there's a reason why they're going back and forth. What's the reason?
They want Jerusalem.
Yeah, the king of the north wants to not only be the king of the north, but he wants to be
King of the South too.
king of the south too. And if he can keep this and get this, he's going to rule the world. Just like the Greeks did under Alexander, just like the Persians did, just like Babylon did. And so, yeah, there's a reason why they go back and forth. They want to rule the world. But God told Daniel in the 3rd year of Cyrus, it's not going to happen that way. It's going to be pared down to 2, and then through history, movement in this area of the world until the days when Jesus comes. Now, this is just detailed information of the big picture. The big picture of Daniel 2, the big picture of Daniel 7, the big picture of Daniel 8. This is just more detailed information. And so, if we keep this in mind, it'll be easier to follow history unfolding. Does that make sense? If we don't have, for example, if we didn't know this, and we get to verse 5 and it says, okay, the king of the south shall be strong, and it starts going on, are we going to be able to place any of that? No. The only way to do it is to place it as the Bible gives it. So, let's see if we can make sense. Now, I'm going to quickly read through verses 5 through 13. What time we got? Yeah, I think we can do this. You're going to love this history, by the way. I think you will. But let's read through the text again. Follow along with me quickly. So verse 5, and the king of the south shall be strong. So that's this guy down here. And at this time, who is the king of the south?
Ptolemy.
Ptolemy is. So king of the south.
And king just refers to the fact that they're the rulers.
Yes.
It doesn't necessarily, it isn't King Ptolemy.
Yeah. So Ptolemy, he's the general. And he takes rule. And back then, they just called those guys kings. Well, in Egypt, they became known as pharaohs. They were not called kings, they were called pharaohs. So Ptolemy is the guy here. And who's the guy up here?
Seleucus.
Yeah.
Yes.
King of the north. At this time as we begin the text, that's Seleucus. And by the way, you can read in his, you can go on encyclopedias, you can go on, what's the encyclopedia online that kind of, Wikipedia, and information is added to that, I guess, on a fairly regular basis. But you can look up the Seleucus dynasty and it'll give you all this information. You can look up the Ptolemaic dynasty and the list of pharaohs and everything. And it's really fascinating reading. So let's see if we're going to read the text here, aren't we? Verse 5, the king of the south shall be strong, and one of his princes. So the king of the south is strong, and one of his princes is strong. And he shall be strong above him, that is the second prince, and have dominion. His dominion shall be a great dominion. And in the end of years they shall do what? Join themselves together. For the king's daughter of the south shall come to the king of the north, and what do? Make an arrangement or make an agreement. We would call that a marriage. But she shall not retain the power of the arm, neither shall he stand nor his arm, but she shall be given up, and they that brought her, and he that begat her, and he that strengthened her in these times. But out of a branch of her roots shall one stand up in his estate, which shall come with an army, and shall enter into the fortress of the king of the north, and shall deal against them, and shall prevail. Shall also carry captives into Egypt, their gods, with their princes, with their precious vessels of silver and gold. He shall continue more years than the king of the north. So the king of the south shall come into his kingdom, and shall return to his own land. But his son shall be stirred up, and shall assemble a multitude of great forces, and one shall certainly come and overflow and pass through. Then shall he return and be stirred up even to his fortress. And the king of the south shall be moved with choler or anger, and shall come forth and fight with him, even with the king of the north. And he shall set forth a great multitude, but the multitude shall be given into his hand. And when he had taken away the multitude, his heart shall be what? Lifted up. And he shall cast down many 10,000, but he shall not be strengthened by it. For the king of the north shall return, and shall set forth a multitude greater than the former, and shall certainly come after certain years with a great army and much riches. And so that's kind of a large bite there. Let me share with you a little bit of history. We have the main points. We don't have the detail, but we have the main points here listed in verse number 9 from these verses. These are the main points. First of all, verse 5, you have the king of the south, and who's that? That's Ptolemy. That's going to be Ptolemy 1, actually. And Seleucus 1. If you read the history on this, Seleucus 1 and Ptolemy 1 were kind of best buddies. Their dads were generals in the army, from Alexander. And this Seleucus one is saved from the area of Babylon over here. He ended up being because he was helping his dad do some work for the army. He ended up being prisoner here. He got freed by the son of Ptolemy. And so the two of them were buddies, and they took over their dad's kingdoms here. But it says that one of them would end up becoming stronger. At this time, one of them would end up becoming stronger. The one that became stronger was Seleucus in the north. So the point here, Ptolemy 1 and Seleucus 1, they're friends at first, but ultimately, what do? They battle for world dominion or supremacy. That's what history tells us. And by the way, history tells us that they battled it out back and forth for about 35 years. And then they went off the scenes, and you have Seleucus' son taking over. His name is Antiochus. He's Antiochus II. Down south, it's Ptolemy II that takes over. So Antiochus II and Ptolemy II, they've seen their dads fighting for 35 years for dominion, and they see it as a waste of time. So guess what they try to do? We will form unity between the north and the south, and we will do it through blood ties. That is, through marriage. And so an agreement was made that Antiochus II would marry Ptolemy II's daughter. Does anybody know her name? Berenice, yes. Berenice. Berenice is the young, beautiful Pharaoh's daughter, this Egyptian princess. Leaves home with her attendants, and travels up north and becomes the wife to Antiochus II. So is the text fulfilled? So does history fulfill the text? Yes. There was a slight problem to the agreement, and that is Antiochus II was already married.
Details.
Details.
What wasn't that called?
He was, yes it was, he was married to a lady named Laodice. And Laodice did not appreciate being set aside. So Antiochus says to his wife Laodice, "Sorry, Laodice, but you are no longer going to be the princess.
Man, a son.
You are going to be set aside. You and the son are going to be set aside. And Berenice is going to take your place. And we're going to produce seed that will keep the kingdoms united." Well, Laodice was not exactly the type of lady that you would cross. Because history tells us that it was not long after the arrangement that all of a sudden Antiochus II met his untimely death. And history believes that he was poisoned. Bernice, who has come from the south with her attendants, comes up to the north. Her husband suddenly dies. And then something happens to her as well. She ends up dying mysteriously. And her attendants end up dying mysteriously.
It's that climate up north.
It's the climate up north that wasn't very healthy. And so the rest, you might say, is history. So verse 6 says, "In the end of years they shall join themselves together, for the king's daughter of the south shall come to the north to make an agreement, but she shall not retain power of the arm." Did that happen? Yes. "Neither shall he stand." And who's the he? Yeah, Antiochus II, whom she married. He doesn't stand, nor his arm, but she shall be given up, and they that brought her. Guess who that is? All her attendants. And he that begat her. The father ended up dying, and he that strengthened her in these times. You know what? You can't make up this kind of stuff. No. God says this is the way it's going to be, and did it happen that way? Yeah. So then what happens next? Verse 7 says, "But out of a branch of her roots." So Berenice, who comes from here, goes to there. She's killed along with all the attendants. But there's a branch out of her roots that ends up getting pretty upset that his sister was taken out. And so enter Ptolemy number 3, brother to Berenice.
So the roots, that's her brother. Then.
That's her brother. And Antiochus III, oh, I'm sorry, I missed the spot here. So Ptolemy III wars against Seleucus number 2. And they battle it out. Ptolemy III, Bernice's brother, gets revenge, so to speak. It moves on from there. You notice verse number 10. So in verse number 7 and 8 is this description of the battle of the south getting even with the north for taking out their princess and her family. You get to verse number 10 then. It says, but his sons shall be stirred up, and shall assemble a multitude of great forces, and one comes. And so if you go to the next line, then what happens? Seleucus 3 and Antiochus 3, they're sons of Seleucus 2. They war against the guy that's down in Egypt now. That's Ptolemy, not 3, but number 4. It takes a while for these things to take place, because after the battle, the losing side is going to end up getting revenge, but they can't get revenge until what?
Go back.
Until they build up their resources and build up their army again. And so 2 sons war against the south. The 2 sons from the north end up warring against the south. And one of them ends up being stronger and carrying on the battle. Seleucus 3 is killed in actually a war over in the east. So Antiochus 3 is the one that wars against Ptolemy 4. Ptolemy 4 gets beaten. And then, what does Ptolemy 4 do? Verse 11, the king of the south then moves with Choler, and shall come forth and fight with him. That is the king of the north. So he wants to get even again. So the next line, Ptolemy 4, ends up winning. This is one battle that history talks quite a bit about. History evidently thought that this was a crucial battle that took place on June 17, 217 BC. It was called the Battle of Raphia. And Ptolemy number 4 wins that battle. The king of the north loses that battle. The king of the south wins the battle. And then we move on to verse number 12. It says, and when he had taken away the multitude, his heart shall be lifted up. So in other words, the king of the south, this would be Ptolemy number 4, he became very prideful. And history tells us that he, after his victory at Raphia, he spent the rest of his rule partying it out. Rather than making the most and best of his opportunities, he ended up relaxing down south and partying it out. In his victories, I have a history book that says that he brought about $4 million worth of gold and silver back down into Egypt that they had lost in previous years. Some of it they had lost even to Babylon when Babylon ruled the world. And so when they won a couple of these battles, they chased Seleucus way back up into the Babylon territory, way back into the mountains here, where the rivers have their source. They came back through Babylon, picked up a lot of riches there that used to belong to Egypt, brought it back down. So when the text says that gold and silver was brought back down to the south, that's what all that is talking about. And so he becomes prideful. But notice one more point in the text says, I'll read verses 12 and 13 again. When he had taken away the multitude, his heart shall be lifted up, and he shall cast down many 10,000s. By the way, guess who the 10,000s were that this Egyptian ruler cast down? Anybody have a hunch? Not only in his battles with the north, but when he came back down through the south, he stopped off at Jerusalem and tried to go into the temple, which he was not allowed. And he got upset when he got back down south to Egypt. He got together armies and just went right around the corner of the Mediterranean there and attacked God's people. And history tells us that there were over 10,000 during that time period that were killed and taken captive by the Egyptian dynasty at that time. We go on a little bit more. It says, but he shall not be strengthened by this work that he did against the surrounding nations, in particular God's people. He wouldn't be strengthened by it. For the king of the north shall return, shall set forth a multitude greater than the former, and shall certainly come after certain years with a great army and with many riches. Our last point here is that Ptolemy IV takes it easy and parties, and then the king of the north, that would be Antiochus III, returns and battles it out, not with Ptolemy number 4, but with Ptolemy number 5, his son. Ptolemy number 5 is how old? 5 years old. And those taking care of the boy king, they appeal to who? The Roman. Rome was not an empire at this time, but they were a republic. And so the little boy king down here, I shouldn't say the little boy king, the attendants, the guardians of the boy king, realize Antiochus III, the king of the north, is coming back down for revenge from the lost battle of Raphia, and that took several years in order for all that to happen. The king of the south, number 4, that won that battle, he's off, he has died, he's off the scene, and his little boy is next in line, but he can't take over kingship until the age of 14. And even then, when he did take over at the age of 14, he ended up making decisions that were not very wise. But the guardians and the attendants of the little boy king, 5 years old, they see that and they realize, we need help. And so they send across the sea and appeal to the Roman Republic for help.
Was Rome just
And
kind of
that's
starting
where Rome ends up coming into the scene of the picture here of the movements between the king of the north and the king of the south.
So Rome at that point was just starting to gain power and...
Yeah, it was a republic on its own. Yeah, it wasn't real strong, but it has, basically the Egyptian empire said, you know what, if we join up with the Roman Republic, we may have enough forces between the two of us right here to take out the Seleucid dynasty.
Was that a Jesuit army that came from Rome then?
No, the Jesuit order is not going to be set up until after the Roman Empire has ruled and after the fall of the Roman Empire. It was during Rome in its papal phase that the Jesuit order was established. That was part of the Counter-Reformation, yes.
After Martin Luther.
Yeah. So that's quite a bit further on down in history. So we've covered kind of the first portion of Daniel 11. Any questions or comments on what we've discussed tonight?
That's amazing how specific God's word is about.
Yeah. I'm amazed. Yeah, the comment is, isn't it amazing how specific Bible prophecy can be? Daniel 2 was the broad strokes of the 4 world empires, and that was about it. Daniel 11 gives the fine-tuned details to Daniel before he dies. So this is, like 500 years before the time of Christ. Gives the details that the king of the north and the king of the south down in history, they're going to be battling it back and forth. They're going to try blood ties to see if that would work. And this is how that's going to come out. And again, in my mind, you can't, a person just sitting down and just starting to write, you wouldn't think of stuff like that. But God knows the end from the beginning. And our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ is described as the Alpha and the Omega. What's the Alpha and the Omega? The beginning of the Greek alphabet and the last letter of the Greek alphabet. The beginning and the end. The first and the last. They have ruled the universe for a long time. And God knows how things are going to work out. God knows you and I better than we know ourselves. It's kind of like, I raised 3 children. They're all in their adult years now. And all I have to do, I can watch my girl. She's 30 years old now. I can watch her, and I know what she's thinking. You know, I know how she's going to respond in situations. And with my boys, it's the same thing. You know, I know how they're going to respond and act in certain situations. Well, how do I know that?
You lived with them already.
Dad, and I watched them grow up from the little, I could hold them in one arm, you know, my daughter's head was right here, her toes kind of tickled my arm right here, you know. I saw her grow up from here to the beautiful young lady that she is today. And if you and I, if we can do that, how much more can God do? We're so limited in our thinkings and in our abilities. And God is all knowledgeable.
Well, he's
All
orchestrating
love.
history anyway.
Yeah. He knows. Yeah, he knows how things are going to go because he knows people. But more than that, he knows this one that's called the devil. He was Lucifer. Lucifer was one of the covering cherubs that stood next to the throne of God. And we don't know how long Lucifer served in that position until sin was found in his heart. You know, it could have been 1 billion years. You know? And so, does God know Lucifer inside and out? Yeah. Does God know what Lucifer is going to do to try to get humanity to not follow? God knows Lucifer and how, you know, and what he's going to do. And so God says, yeah, I know this is what the devil's, he's going to take the angle on this, and so this is what my plan is going to be. And then he tells it to Daniel, he tells it to John, John writes it down in the book of Revelation, and then we are given this material from the heart of God to see how God is going to take care of his people all through time. Yeah, praise God. Well, let's stand and have our closing prayer. Jeff, why don't you pray for us?
Father in heaven, we're just so very thankful for the opportunity to come together and open your word. We just ask that you would go with each one of us, you would go to this place, that you would watch over us, you would fill us with your spirit, that we might glorify you in all that we do. We thank you for your word that gives us the assurance that, Father, you are in control. And that we just offer up our lives to you. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.